Okay, let us begin. Today is actually quite an interesting day in terms of what it represents. the day of the 5th of Tevet, which is today, well, that was the 5th of Teves in the Hebrew calendar. It represents a day which is very much connected with books. With books and with learning. So I thought I would teach something today from the famous book, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation. And the Book of Formation is, according to tradition, was compiled or composed by Abraham Avinu, and was written down later on, many generations later, by Rabbi Akiva, one of the sages of the Talmud, one of the great sages of the Talmud. And he was said to have written it down, much like the rest of the Talmud was written down. It was teachings that were passed down from the time of Moses, but they were handed down orally until such time as it was deemed necessary to write it down in the rudimentary form first, called the Mishnah, and later on, in terms of Talmudic discussion, all the discussion behind the Mishnah was also written down later on in even later generations. But according to this tradition, the Sefer Yetzirah was part of the set of Mishnah. Although it's not recorded in the 6 orders of the Mishnah, but it's from the same period of time, written down by Rabbi Akiva. And the teachings there are very, very cryptic and somewhat difficult to understand. And particularly since, as we'll see, there are many interpretations, as well as various different what are called girsaot versions, ways that you read. Hebrew is a language which is written with standard letters, but the vowels don't come between the letters as you find in English, but the vowel sounds are under and above the letters and below the letters, sometimes in the middle of the letters as well. But the vowel sounds are not generally written down. They're either understood or handed down by tradition. So therefore, you can sometimes read the same word in different ways by giving it different vowel sounds if one doesn't have the tradition, or even if one does. But it can be very revealing and very interesting to understand these words, these letters, in different ways with different vowel sounds. And that's actually what we have in this particular case. There is wrong document here. There's a document which I will share with you now, which I just took out a small section of the first Mishnah, or the first teaching, in the first chapter of Sefer Yetzirah. I didn't translate it into English, but I'll read it to you and then translate it out loud. It talks about how God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, bara es olamoi, He created His world, b'shloisha sfarim, with 3 things that are called sfarim. Now, usually the word sfarim means books, but we'll see how this pans out shortly. It can mean other things as well. We'll see shortly. So He created His world with 3 things, 3 interpretations of this word, and the Sefer Yetzirah now goes on to interpret what these are. Besefer, if we read it that way, we can read it in different ways. We'll see. Besefer means a book. Besvar, number, and sipur is a story. That's one interpretation. That's one way of reading these words. In fact, I'm going to present 3 ways. There's actually more than 3 ways, but 3 main ways to read these 3 words over here. There's 3 different ways of reading it. First, I'll read it according to Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. Rabbi Moshe Cordovero was the person who is largely responsible for codifying the teachings of the Zohar and the teachings of Kabbalah up until his time. And he laid it all out in a very seminal work called Pardes Rimonim, the pomegranate, the orchard of pomegranates, the pomegranate orchard. Now, why he chose this particular name, I'm not going to go into now, but it is an interesting name. It has to do with the number of seeds that a pomegranate has and the way it grows and so on and so forth. But in any event, in other words, it's a compilation of different teachings. Each teaching is like a seed, and it's compiled into a fruit, which is very nourishing and sustaining and beautiful to eat and beautiful to look at and so on and so forth. There's a lot of comparisons to the pomegranate tree and the fruit. So the Ramak, he was the first one he's the first one we're going to look at. He says like this: he created his world. God created his world. I can make this bigger if you want. Is that better? Not actually look in the comments. Let's see what the comments are here. Oh no, you're not hearing audio? There should be audio. Oh, you do now. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the Ramak again, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, he reads this as Sefer, a book, Svar, number, and Sipur, story. Now, let me explain what we're dealing with over here. We're talking about the created world. In other words, we're talking about the world in which we live essentially was created with a sefer, was created with a book. In other words, there was a blueprint. The sefer is the blueprint, right? That's the blueprint by which the creation sort of unfolds, by which it is, the blueprint according to which it is built, so to speak, right? Just like when you have when you build a building, so you have blueprints, and then you have a ledger, so to speak. I think that's actually what it's called, a ledger of all of the components that are necessary. In other words, how many bricks you're going to need, and how many tons of cement, and whatever else is needed in the building thereof, rivets and metal frames and whatever, all those kind of things written in the ledger, which is decided not by the architect so much, but there's a certain engineer, I forget what he's called, an engineer who makes these sort of decisions and explanations of, he writes down in his ledger. So this concept of Sefer, the book, is both the blueprint and the ledger describing what's necessary in order for the building to exist. Okay? Right. Good. The word svar means number. So first of all, there's the blueprint. Then comes the number. In other words, the limitation of the building, the limitation of what is going to be. The number represents, even though there you could have, I suppose, an infinite number, but infinite numbers don't compute in our world, because nothing could be infinite in that sense. But theoretically infinite numbers. But what we mean over here is that number is a defined entity. So we have a blueprint, we have definition of defined things, and then we have what is called the sipur, the unfolding of the story. The word sipur is story, the unfolding of history. The unfolding of history. So, that is according to the Ramak, and I'll explain these things a little bit more deeply. I just want to go through them first. Okay, that's what the Ramak says. Along comes Rabbi Chaim Vital. Now, Rabbi Chaim Vital was also a Kabbalist who lived contemporary with Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, which is in the 1500s. But he became the chief disciple of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the Arizal. He was the chief disciple of the Arizal. Now, the Arizal was a revolution in Kabbalistic thought. He brought about a revolution in Kabbalistic thought, a completely different way of looking at things, whereas the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, looked at things in somewhat of a sort of a linear way, you could say. In other words, his interest was the derivation of the worlds. In other words, how the reality which we see came into being. So therefore you can see why he translates it as Sefer, Sfar, and Sipur, because Sefer is the plan according to which the whole thing is built. Sfar is the limitation, in other words, the actual manifestation in number. Sipur is how it works out in time, in history, like the story over time. Okay? But the Rabbi Chaim Vital says it slightly differently. He says, first of all, Sfar refers to mispar, refers to number, right? Also refers to number, as we said before. But then he reads it as Sfar. Sfar means limitation, gvul, borders. Now there's a difference between number and border, because even though a number has a definition, nevertheless, since numbers can be added together and since numbers can just basically theoretically continue forever, each number has to be defined as meaning some particular thing. That's called the concept of sfar, gvul, limitation. So, when we limit something, let's say I'm counting a group of people and I say that there's 100 people in the group. Now, that gives you some understanding of the nature of the group. There's 100 people in the group. But it doesn't give you an understanding of each of the individuals thereof. The individuals in the group are characterized by this next word called sfar, right? Sfar, gvul, limitation. How is each individual divided off from the other person? How is this person different from the other person? How is this entity and that entity different from each other? And finally, again, Sipur. Sipur is, as we said before, the unfolding of the story. The unfolding of the story, in other words, the unfolding of events through time. Okay, now that is how the Rabbi Chaim Vital sees it. Now, again, we're talking about the creation of the world. So God created the world according to Rabbi Chaim Vital with number, limitation, and with time, the unfolding of things over a period of time, history. Okay. Along comes the teachings of Chassidus. Chassidus is the teachings essentially of the Baal Shem Tov and the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov down through our times. And he also gave a revolutionary insight into Kabbalistic ideas. We said before that Rabbi Chaim, the Ramak, the first opinion, the first approach over here, was kind of linear. Let's call it developmental. His approach was developmental. Rabbi Chaim Vital's approach, which was the approach of the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, his approach was what you might call the social approach. Social is not really the right word, but it's the interactions between the elements that interest us. That's what interested him most. The interaction of elements and how each element in a unit of whatever sort affects the other ones, and how they work together perhaps as a whole, or how they work against each other. And this was his interest. His interest was, the technical word for it in Kabbalah is actually hitlavshut, which means literally enclosement. How one thing becomes enclosed within the other. In other words, basically how one thing affects another, and what the relationship between them is. So the dynamics of the group is what he's interested in. So the first opinion, again, was developmental. The second looks at the dynamics, the interactive dynamics. And the Baal Shem Tov came along, and he looked at how, the idea is called Hashra'ah. Hashra'ah means dwelling upon, literally. In other words, how all of this relates to, essentially, to godliness, to God. How all of this relates to the dwelling of holiness upon this particular entity, or this group, or this creation, or whatever it may happen to be. Okay, so therefore the Baal Shem Tov explains, or the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov explain, that we have the book, Sefer. I'll look at the first one afterwards. We have the word Sefer, the book, in other words, the blueprint of creation. We have the Sipur, the unfolding of creation through history, through time. And we have the Sefer. What's the Sefer? The Sefer is the author, right? We have the author. So this is a very, very different teaching from the others, because what it focuses on is the author of the book. The author of the book, and therefore the author of history. In other words, the impact of divine providence, essentially, on the unfolding of creation through time. And that's what interested the Baal Shem Tov. Okay, so let's speak about these now in a little bit more, in some greater detail, greater understanding. When the Ramak talked about, Ramak Rabbi Moshe Cordovero talked about going back to the first process. When he talked about the developmental concept, the developmental ideas, it wasn't that he was excluding God from the picture, obviously not. Everyone agrees that the creation came about through divine action. However, what interests him and what he focuses on is what is actually developed, what actually comes about as a result. In other words, you could say it like this. The Ramak focuses upon the skeleton of the being of the human. If we would regard this whole process as a human being, then why do I do that? Because why am I comparing it to a human being? Because there's a verse that says, "Mi besari echazeh Elokai," from my own flesh I can understand godliness. So we're trying to understand these concepts now, and the concept that we're trying to understand, we can understand from looking at an example of ourselves being the analogy, and then we learn an analog from that, right? So what does the Ramak look at? The Ramak looks at, essentially, he looks at the skeleton. Yeah, how the thigh bone is connected to how the knee bone is connected to the thigh bone, and the thigh bone is connected to the hip bone, and so on and so forth. You know, I think that there's an old jazz song that goes like that, if I'm not mistaken, right? So, in other words, how all the bones are connected and how all the pieces fit in and exactly where they fit in, and this is this sphera and that's that sphera and so on and so forth. Yeah, this divine emanation sphera, that's a different divine emanation, and how they all connect and so on and so forth, right? So he is looking at the what thereof. What is it? And how does it all fit together? The Arizal comes along, and he says you can't just look at the bare skeleton. You have to look at the living being. right? You have to look at the whole person. You can't look at just the bones and expect to understand what a human being is. There's an interaction of the bones, right? All bones interact with all other bones. It's not just that they're connected to them. They're all part of the same human being. And therefore, they all perform a function within the greater function of what a human being is, right? So we're not just looking at what the thing is, but how the entire thing works, how the entire thing works together in our Mishnah over here from Sefer Yetzirah, how the world interacts, and all the powers that create the world interact with one another and form, so to speak, relationships. How all these powers form relationships, and sometimes antithetical relationships, but mostly congruous or I don't know, what's the word, the opposite of antithetical, thetical? I don't know what the word is, but harmonious relationships, right? Mostly harmonious, but sometimes inharmonious relationships. That's what our Arizal looks at. Along comes the Baal Shem Tov, and he looks at it. He doesn't say, no, we're not talking about what. We're not even talking about how. We're talking about why. Why all of this exists. What's the whole purpose thereof? Why is it all there? What's the world all about? So the Baal Shem Tov says, therefore, that the concept of creation is the story that unfolds, right? The book is the blueprint, which unfolds in the story. In other words, what's the blueprint? The blueprint is God's intention in the creation. The Sipur is the unfolding of that intention within the created world over time through history, in order to bring us to an understanding of the author. It's not good enough to understand the creation, even if we understand the creation perfectly, which we don't. But the whole point is to understand the author. Now, there's a famous question over here which is asked about one of the great sages of Jewish philosophy and Jewish law, was someone who was named Maimonides, the Rambam, Maimonides. And he wrote a very, very comprehensive work which encompasses all of the teachings of the Torah, all of the teachings of the Talmud, all of the teachings of the oral Torah, in a work which he called Mishnah Torah. In other words, the second book after the Torah. He says in his introduction, you don't need anything else. You only need scripture and my book, and you'll have it all, right? Which, you might think is an arrogant claim, but he wasn't an arrogant person, so it's not really an arrogant claim. It just happens to be true. But it did cause a lot of controversy at that time. In any event, the Rambam, Maimonides, when he explains the planetary systems and how the planetary systems work, he relies, because that's also part of his, it's the science part of his magnum opus, and the scientific part of his magnum opus relied very heavily on Greek and Roman scientists, Greek and Roman mathematicians and philosophers and scientists and so on and so forth. And he basically described the system of the planetary system the same way Ptolemy, he openly says that he got it from Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic system. And for this he was criticized by many of his peers. And in fact, at a certain point in time, some of his books were burned. All of his books were burned, but he survived it historically. He survived the burning of his books, and because they were considered to be somewhat heretical, as a result of one of the factors was they had copied Ptolemaic science and not the teachings of the sages as far as this was concerned. There was reasons for it, but let's not get into that now. The idea was, he explained, that the scientists at the time, people who were involved in the sciences at the time, knew more than the sages about the planetary systems, and this is what got him into trouble. It got him into tremendous trouble. Now, many years later, a disciple of a disciple of a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, in fact, a descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, someone named Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin. Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin, a very, very great sage. He lived probably in 1800s, late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin. So he explained what Maimonides meant when he said that the Greek sages or the Roman sages knew more, Ptolemy was Greek, knew more about astronomy than the sages. He explained it by way of an analogy. He said as follows: a king invites the greatest sages of the generation to private audience, one by one, individual private audience. And as they go in one by one, there's a certain time for their appointment. And as they go in one by one, so some of the sages are, as they go in, they're struck as they walk down the very long halls and see all the various rooms that branch off these halls. They see in one beautiful sculptures, and another one paintings, and another room various other types of artwork, and there's gardens and so on and so forth. And as they're going through to get to the inner chamber, which is where the king is, they stop off and they marvel at the artwork, they marvel at the music, they marvel at the tapestries, they marvel at the gardens and the beauty and the scents and so on and so forth. And they're marveling to such a great extent that they miss their appointment. One sage, who's just as delighted with the outer trappings as they are, understands that his mission is to go to see the king. So he only glances cursorily at these other chambers, and he moves on to the main room. Yeah, he moves on to the main room. The inner chamber where the king resides, because that's his intention. He wants to see, he wants to be able to see the king. He's not interested in the outer rooms as much as he's interested in seeing the king. He gets to see the king. So says said Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin, this was Maimonides. Maimonides wanted to see the king. He wasn't so interested in the outer rooms, and therefore he said, when it comes to astronomy and so on and so forth, I will rely on the sages of our time, because presumably they've done the proper investigations, and I'm going to rely on them, because I'm not looking into what the construction of the world, how it's constructed in terms of astronomy and so on, is not that important to me. What's important to me is the author of the book, right? The author of the book, the person who's the one who is behind this whole thing. In other words, God. That's what concerns me. That's what I want to know about. So basically, the idea here, that's the answer that Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin gave as to why the Rambam Maimonides said what he said. In any event, the idea here is that we have this tremendous, beautiful creation all around us, and we can look at it from a very scientific point of view. We can look at it developmentally. We can look at it in terms of its interaction with, place in the universe, with other worlds, with what's going on, interactions in the universe itself, and so on and so forth, within our world itself. Or we can look at, or rather look for, the author of all of these things and what it was that he intended, the why we are here. And that is the interpretation that the Baal Shem Tov puts forth. He says what we're looking for here is the dwelling upon of godliness. This is what we're looking for. We're looking for God in the picture, so to speak. And whatever it is, it doesn't matter if it's history that we're looking at, or we're looking at the blueprint, or even if we're looking at the blueprint as it unfolds through history in terms of the entire world, whatever detail we're looking at, what we really want to look at and understand and relate to and form a relationship with is the author of this whole thing. And that essentially is what the Sefer Yetzirah is talking about. God created his world with these three things, but he's part of them. In other words, God is part of the creation. When I say part of the creation, I don't mean in a pantheistic kind of a way. I mean that God is intimately involved with creation, not like those who say that God left the world. He created the world and he's not involved with it any longer. There are religious theories that posit it like that. Why should God waste his time with a lowly world like ours? He's got better things to do, so to speak. The Jewish point of view in general, and particularly the Hasidic point of view, is that God is intimately involved with every moment and every detail of creation all of the time. It's called divine providence, hashgacha pratis. Now, I know there are some who are listening, or some who will listen, who will argue that this is not necessarily the meaning of divine providence. You may be right in terms of the way others define it, but not in terms of the way the Baal Shem Tov defines it. One of these days we'll actually look into that perhaps in greater detail, the whole concept of divine providence, but suffice it to say, just in the thumbnail version, that God is intimately involved with every aspect of his creation right throughout time, constantly, always, without blinking, so to speak. And that is why the books are so important. We are called, the Jewish people are often called the people of the book. That's not exactly a true title. We call the people of the author of the book. It's much more important than the book itself. Not that doesn't minimize the importance of the book. The book is simply the recorded version of what it is that God wants and so on. It's obviously very important, but we can't stop just with the book. We've got to look for the author within the book. And that is what the importance of books are on this day of Hey Tavis, the 5th of Tavis. I just want to point out again, for those of you who aren't aware, that there's a course. Unfortunately, I haven't finished. I've been so busy traveling around all over the place. I haven't finished giving them, even recording the courses and uploading them. But there are courses on Alignable, Kabbalah Decoded, .alignable, HTTPS, / Kabbalah-decoded.alignable.com, and there you will find the courses available, and there's courses in basic Kabbalah, you might, the essentials of Kabbalah, which are being updated, but it's not completed yet. I've only almost finished the second course out of 5. So, for anyone who might be interested. Okay, any questions?